Hello, good morning. In the next couple of minutes, I will be doing a presentation on the topic, Introduction to Diversity and Inclusion. This is a human resource management topic targeted at final year undergraduate students. I'm Dr. Loliya Akobo. We'll first of all start by looking at the learning outcomes. For this particular topic, we have four learning outcomes that at the end of the lecture, we should be able to understand and define the concept of diversity and inclusion. We should be able to determine what the key diversity elements and or dimensions are. How are this kind of structured? How can an organization identify the key diversity dimensions that are of concern even within its space? We'd also look at exploring some theories that can be used to explain perspectives of diversity or diversity and inclusion. And then we'll look at evaluating the concept of diversity and inclusion within a context. So this context could be at the organizational level or at the national level. Like I said, because this is an introductory topic, introducing a topic or a subject matter, which is diversity and inclusion in this instance, what we will do is try to understand the history and evolution. How did it start and how is it going? We'd also look at the diversity dimension perspectives or approaches, and specifically looking at the business case, the ethical, the legal, and demographics. We'll look at, again, some of the theories that help explain this and that can be applied at the global north or global south level or space. And then we'll try to examine diversity dimensions at the national organizational context. So that's trying to look at how it's been developed, how it's been practiced, what are some of those policies that have been developed, how is it implemented, what are the challenges at the national level organizational context. So this is more like a discussion between students and everyone drawing from experiences or the knowledge that we have within that space or within that room. So again, like I said, we'll start with the concept of diversity and we'll be using the Rick-Ladd dimension wheel, trying to understand identities, social identities. How are people identified? How can people be identified? And Rick-Ladd's wheel kind of shows four levels of identification: the primary, secondary, organization, and cultural. So this would also be like a discussion where people will be given the time to identify, look within themselves, reflect, and try to see how will they identify themselves? What are some of those social identities that is familiar with them in terms of their personalities, in terms of how they see themselves, and how that can also reflect with how they see others as well. And then we'll progress to looking at the history and evolution of diversity and inclusion. We'll talk about affirmative action, how it started in America, looking at social justice and equality and fairness. And then what were some of those key dimensions that were in existence, or the primary focus at that time, looking at race and gender. And then we'll progress to valuing differences, how organizations began to think about the relevance of diversity, the benefits of it within the organizational context. So while it was valuing differences in places like the United States, it was equal employment opportunity in the United Kingdom as well. And then how that conversation kind of progressed to diversity and inclusion, and why it's necessary to include people, why it's necessary to not just only understand the fact that people are actually different and that their difference can be a benefit, but also looking at inclusion even within the business space. And then also how it's evolving to bring in conversations about equality, about belonging, and then how it's progressing or how it's going. We would also try to look at the perspectives of diversity management. So I've highlighted the business case, ethical case, the legal case, and demography. So what we're going to be doing in terms of looking at this perspective is, first of all, understanding the rationale behind each of these perspectives. So why will organizations think about the business case? Why will they think about it, the benefits with regard to the business case? And then trying to understand how theory can be used to explain this practice of thinking about the business case. So for example, we have the resource-based theory that helps us understand how organizations, using their structure or understanding of what their goals, aims, and objectives are, how they identify resources, what are some of these resources that have the capabilities, and how those resources can attract different clienteles to be able to create that competitive advantage for the business. And different clientele means representation of different kinds of people. And then also how that makes the business or a very attractive business within the industry, and how that becomes like a strategy and formulation with regards to the implementation of the practice to be able to keep that competitive advantage status. So again, it's about understanding how theory is relevant to explaining practice. And within this context of diversity and inclusion, we also have the institutional theory that helps us understand the environment, influence of the environment on the organization, and helps us to look at legitimacy and shared values, and helps us to understand how regulations are built, regulations are developed, how they're put into practice or implementation, and how what is some of the behavioral aspects that could actually come out as a result of that from the perspective of individuals working within an organization. So we look at the ethical case, again, how that relates back to the history of social justice and fairness and equality. And we'll look at the theory by John Rawls, the theory that looks at in terms of fairness and equal opportunities, and how people have to sometimes look at their morals and how it's a moral thing to be able to ensure that everyone has that equal opportunity, even without necessarily having regulations and legitimacy in place. So we'd also progress to demographics to try to understand what is, again, the relevance of it, what is the rationale, why do organizations have to understand the demographic pool, and how does that help for recruitment, retention, how does that help with regards to succession planning within the business? So this, again, will also try to understand some of the key dimensions or characteristics of demography. So that's talking about the birth rate, the death rate, and migration. Why do people migrate? The economic reasons behind that. Looking at the death rate of within a population and how that affects the workforce, or the birth rate within a population and how that affects the workforce as well. So we'll look at it with regards to developing countries as well as developed countries, and how that kind of affects job employment and organizational growth or representation within a business. Some of the theories we'll be looking at will try to make us understand how difference in wages and employment rates can actually cause emigration or migration, or looking at in terms of capital within levels within a country context and the labor market, and try to understand how also governments or institutions try to put in place systems that help to reduce migration or immigration, just so that they can build their economy, and then be able to have proper representation within the workforce, or also at the same time to be able to have a proper representation with regards to the kind of clients they actually attract. We'll look at the legal case and what does this entail, how this covers policies, regulations, and what are some of the rationales behind the legal case. We can also use the institutional theory to explain the legal case, as well as the framework like the Equality Act 2010. So we'll try to understand how the Equality Act was developed, looking at different legislative pieces that was brought together, and what are the protected characteristics discussed within the Equality Act 2010, and how companies can actually use this document, adapt this document within their policies to ensure, again, talking about legal compliancy, and then how this can also enable the business also structure the diversity and inclusion policies as well. So once we go through this, we'll also have time for questions, where students can actually ask questions with regards to each side, each aspect of the topic. So where we talked about the concept, where we talked about the perspectives, where we look at theories that help explain these perspectives, and then where we kind of looked at some of the rationales behind the perspectives, and we try to understand why organizations engage with it, how they engage with it, and then also trying to understand what are some of the implications at the organizational level as well. We'll have time to discuss, and the discussion section would also look at some of the key diversity dimensions emphasized within organizations, and also looking at the news as well, because that also kind of influences what organizations do, and why we kind of like understand why is this deliberated, at the national level as well as the organizational level. We'll also discuss why organizations consider diversity and inclusion and what kind of structures do they have in place with regards to the management of diversity and inclusion. We'll also again talk about how and why theories can be used to explain the practice of diversity and inclusion. And this would be a bit more practical because we'll look at different case studies just to be able to understand how theory can be used to explain some of these practices that we can actually see in the day-to-day operations within businesses as well. So that's what we're going to be doing for the within the subject or topic introduction to diversity and inclusion at the final year undergraduate level. Thank you very much.